I switched gears just a little bit. I had a talk that I'm going to give a lot of it, but a lot of you have asked me. By the way, I've loved the conversation, and it's just been a blast being here and making new friends. And but there's one question that's come up over and over, and it's, where are the young people, and how do we continue to reach a generation of young people? And so I thought, let me just start by saying, I think one of the things that I'm realizing is that we've begun to lose a lot of young people in the church, in part because we've disconnected from the world that we live in. And they're very aware that the world that they've been handed is very fragile and messed up. And sometimes we've only offered them heaven when we die. At least that's what I heard about growing up. And as someone said, sometimes we can be so heavenly minded that we're not much earthly good. And so people began to leave the church. But at the end of the day, the kingdom of God that I read about isn't just about going up when we die, but bringing God's kingdom down, right? It's about how we look at the world and live in the world that we live in. And so as I travel, I get to meet all these young people that are doing it. You know, they're doing beautiful things. And there was this one event in the Midwest that this guy came up and started telling me his story. And I was like, holy cow, I got so excited. I wished I had a camera, and I realized I had a documentarian traveling with me. I was like, grab your cameras, we got to get this guy. And so we taped him. And I thought just because it's wonderful that you could hear this story of a young man named Mark Weaver.
While I was in California, I started reading The Irresistible Revolution by Shane Claiborne. So much to my brother Rick, he sent me a copy of the book. And as I was reading it, I was totally inspired, and I was feeling convicted inside, living in one of the richest communities in America in Orange County, California, and I was part of these mega churches. I wasn't living as selfless as I could be, and would you really give all your possessions away, sell them to the poor, and follow me? And I was challenged and convicted, would I really do something like that? But I kind of shrugged it off. I was like, well, I really don't even have any possessions. But the next day, some of my friends came to visit me from Indiana and California, and they wanted to go get on the show The Price is Right.
Here it comes from the Bob Barker studio at CBS in Hollywood.
We got in line, and they actually called my name up.
And Mark Weaver, come on down.
The actual retail price is $14.49. Mark, you're a winner. Mark, you're a winner.
60, Bob.
60. He's going to try 60. We're looking for the back of the car, and there it is. $17,260. I'll shake the hand of a winner. You have to beat 85 cents to get into the showcase, and you did it. You will be in the showcase at the end of the show.
With his new range. In romantic Paris. Of her brand new convertible.
$6,192. Mark is the winner.
I ended up winning the whole showcase showdown on The Price is Right. I won almost $60,000 in prizes. I won 2 cars, a trip for 2 to Paris, a stove, and a rug. It was really cool. But then I remembered the words that Shane wrote in his book, so I decided to sell the 2 cars that I won on the show right back to the dealership. And I used the money to fly to Uganda, Africa, and I just decided to live in orphanages for a while and just give all the money away to them.
You might break me, and if I say too much.
The orphanage Mark lived in is for children who lost their parents to AIDS. For each one of these beautiful children here, 2 people died from the AIDS epidemic.
nothing ever felt better than to just give away the money rather than to keep it and get something for myself. I've never been without a meal. I've never been without a shirt on my back. Stuff like that is the least I could do. And if everybody gave a little bit like that, I think this world would be a better place.
We'll be right back.
I like that. I like that story, and part of why I like it is because it ends with Mark not leaving the church, but actually I've kept in touch with him a little bit, and he's a pastor. And he's a pastor back in Southern California, where he came from, and he's committed to raising up a generation that's connecting the gospel to the world that we live in right now. I like how Karl Barth said that we've got to read the Bible in one hand and the newspaper in the other, right? So that our faith doesn't just become a ticket into heaven and a license to ignore the world around us. And that's, I'm convinced that if young people continue to leave the church, it won't be because we didn't entertain them with loud enough, hip enough punk rock music with tight, skinny jeans, but because we didn't trust them with the truth of the gospel in light of the reality of the world that we live in. It won't be because we made the gospel too hard, but because we made it too easy. And what happened to us in Philadelphia is I was studying sociology, I was studying the Bible, but then as I was in the middle of college, one of my friends threw down the newspaper, and he said, "You got to read this." And we read the story of a group of homeless families in Philadelphia, mothers and children. In fact, the fastest growing homeless population in our country, in the U.S., is women and children. And it's the least amount of space in the shelter system. And we had 3,000 families on the waiting list for affordable housing in Philadelphia. So these families had no place to go, and they had moved into an abandoned Catholic church building, which has a lot of depth to it, I think, in general. Just that we had a lot of abandoned church buildings. And they saw, we have 20,000 abandoned buildings in Philadelphia, but this wasn't just any building. This was a church building. And so they moved into it seeking sanctuary and refuge. But as we continued to read the newspaper, it was heartbreaking because it ended by saying the archdiocese had given them an ultimatum, an eviction notice of 48 hours. And if they weren't out in 2 days, they could be arrested for trespassing on church property. Something about that just didn't feel right, And so it was one of those moments, though, where we began to pray. We had a prayer meeting, And then somebody said, "Hey, here we are throwing our hands up at God, saying, 'God, why don't you do something?' Maybe God's saying to us, 'I did do something. I made you. Get down there.'" And so we went down and we found the families. They embraced us with open arms, and on the front of the cathedral, they had hung a banner that said, "How can we worship a homeless man on Sunday and ignore one on Monday?" In fact, they were brilliant. They held a press conference, and they invited the media, and they said, "In all respect to the archdiocese, we want to say that we've talked to the real owner of this building. And the Lord said we can stay until we figure something else out." In fact, Catholic clergy were outraged by this. Some of the nuns that used to live in this building, they were so outraged. They went to the Archdiocese building and they held an exorcism to cleanse the principalities and powers. And they weren't kidding. In fact, they got arrested. And one of my friends, he went to court and he was like, "Yeah, it was interesting because there's a judge." And the judge is like, "Okay, the plaintiff in the case of the Archdiocese and the defendants are nuns and priests." And so he said, "You guys got to figure this out." And he sentenced my friend to write a theological thesis on why he didn't obey the archdiocese orders, And it was amazing because it stirred something in our city. And the media was making it look like the church was kicking homeless people out. And that's because the church was kicking homeless people out, and it didn't look good, And so, one thing happened after another. I'll tell you just one more little story. Was that they said, "Well, we'll spin it different. We'll end up saying it's in the interest of their safety." And they brought in the fire marshal, and they said, "Well, say, And so that was the tactic. But the night before the fire marshal was supposed to come, these firefighters knocked at the door, and it was almost midnight. And we came to the door. open the door, and there's firefighters out there, and we're like, oh, initially I just thought, man, they've come in the middle of the night, right? And we thought there's no media here, the kids are asleep, so we start defensively kind of saying, could you please come back tomorrow? We thought you were coming tomorrow. And then he said, no, listen, the guy said, we're not exactly here on orders. We're a little off the clock, and we know the whole story of what's happening, and it's just not right. So we're with you. We're going to help you get ready. And they said, you need some work to do in this place because the fire marshal's coming tomorrow. And they took us through and they helped us get exit signs and smoke detectors and fire extinguishers. And we worked all night. And the next day, the fire marshal came with all the media and the archdiocese officials and walked through. And the fire marshal's like, okay, not bad. I'm not kicking them out. Boom! You know what? It felt like God was in the struggle. It was our baptism in justice, but it was also where our faith came to life because we were having communion in there inside this old building, and it was like stale bagels and old apple cider, but it felt holy. Felt sacramental. It was there that we started reading the book of Acts and saw that all the believers were together and they shared everything they had. No one claimed that their possessions were their own, and we caught a new vision for the church. It was in here that we sort of said we're going to stop complaining about the church that we've experienced and work on becoming the church that we dream of, that God dreams of. And so it ignited our vision. Now, we didn't know too much about the mystics and St. Francis and San Damiano. We were kind of learning about all this as we went, but it was great because we've always had some wonderful radical Catholic mentors. And early on, some of the older monastics, we're supposed to call them classic, the traditional monastic orders came in, the Benedictines and stuff, and they said to us, we love what's happening. You're starting communities and the new monasticism, all this stuff. And they said, we just want you to know that if we're there for you. If you want to talk or bounce some ideas around, we've been doing community for a while, about 1,600 years. So we've learned a few things, and it's folks like Sister Margaret McKenna. She's been kind of my mentor, and she says, she was a hermit in the desert. She lived in the desert for years and years, and then she began to see that the hermits were to be hermits for others, right? That they're to be for other people, and so she said, I just began to discover that the inner city is the contemporary desert. It's where we find God. It's where we build a new society in the shell of the old one. It's where we begin to bring things back to life and love people back to life. It's our desert, and she lives in community. She moved into abandoned houses and started fixing them up, and now she lives in community with like 50 people recovering from drugs and alcohol addictions, a community called New Jerusalem. And Sister Margaret has been my mentor, and she's wonderful and wild. She's one of those John Deere Berrigan brothers. She went and beat on the Tomahawk missiles and went to jail and stuff. And she's an amazing woman though. And But we got arrested a few times for when Pennsylvania was still executing. We chained ourselves and kneeled down to try to stop executions. And she was pepper sprayed, and we were arrested just for a nonviolent prayerful vigil. But afterwards, when we went to trial, we were sentenced to go to citizenship training classes. I love it. So I'm like in these classes with an 80-year-old nun, and we're learning to be better law-abiding citizens. But I look at her, and she's taught me that, like so many folks have seen, this Jacques Ellul used to say, I don't know where we get the notion that Christians are just meant to be normal. Christians at their best have been holy troublemakers, divine mischief makers, folks who refuse to conform to the world as it is and insist on building the world God dreams of. And Sister Margaret's one of those, and she got very sick a year or so ago, and I went to visit her, took her some flowers in the hospital, and she gave me this very dramatic, emotional, spiel about how she may not make it through, and she'll be waiting for me on the other side, right up front. She said, I'll be waving as soon as you come in and all this. And then I called a week later to check on her, and they said, oh, she's better. She got arrested yesterday at the Pentagon. So that's my mentor, like that. That's when people tell me that radical Christianity is a phase of our youth. I say, you need to meet Sister Margaret. She's been in the phase for about 60 years. That's like, so that keeps us alive and young. And it's that which I think also, as we think about justice and connecting to the world that we live in, I'm convinced that part of what we have to do is we have to be near to the pain. I talked about that a little bit yesterday, about stories like the Good Samaritan. They would have never happened if people weren't walking down the streets where people get beat up. And those are the streets we've tried to move away from. So we've got to live in and near to the streets of injustice. And then when we are living near to injustice, we don't have to figure out what justice issue to get involved in. Like, those things come right in our face. Like I think of gun violence and healthcare and all these things. Like, they have names and faces. When I moved into my neighborhood, one of the first people I met was a woman named Miss Betty. And Miss Betty was an incredible grandmother, caretaker for her kids. And yet she had a little house fire. And she had applied, it was in the kitchen, so she was trying to fix up her house. And meanwhile, the Department of Human Services came in, and that's our child protection agency, and they took her grandkids away. And she had applied for that grant to fix up her kitchen, and then her kids got taken away. And then she got a letter from the city that said, we're sorry you've been denied the grant because we're giving priority to families that have kids living in their house. So she couldn't get the grant because she didn't have her kids. She couldn't get her kids because she didn't have the money to fix her house up. And that's what the scripture talks about when it speaks of principalities and powers, right? That we're not up against flesh and blood, but systems and structures and bureaucratic barriers and spiritual powers that hold people down and destroy people's dignity. And so as we connect to the pain, like all those issues, we never know what's next. But if we're connected to the people that are disenfranchised, then we will know where injustice happens, right? In Atlanta, our friends are a part of a wonderful community there called the Open Door Community, probably familiar to some of you. Amazing folks. In Atlanta, they started having anti-homeless laws, just like the ones in Philly I mentioned to you. But in Atlanta, they were targeting people when they used the restroom. And people were given citations for public indecency when they couldn't find a bathroom and they're, peeing behind a tree or in an alleyway or behind a dumpster. And they were even being registered sometimes as sex offenders, as a sex crime, because they couldn't find a restroom. And the Open Door and others came together and they said, this is outrageous. And they started a campaign in the streets called Pee for Free with Dignity. Come on, right? And they carried toilets to the mayor's office demanding public restrooms in Atlanta and saying, we can't arrest people for peeing if we don't have public bathrooms, right? So it's that kind of movement that comes when we're near to those who are hurting. In Philly, we thought we had beat the anti-homeless laws because we had set a legal precedent years ago, but then just a few years ago, 2 years ago, our mayor passed another ordinance that said it's illegal to distribute food to more than 4 people in public. Something about 5 was just too much, and we said, well, we can't not feed folks. Well, we already had our T-shirts from like 10 years before that said, if Jesus had done the fish and loaves feeding in Philly, he would have gone to jail, and so we got our old T-shirts out. And if you didn't get that joke, just talk to me afterwards. But anyway, but we're like we started coming out and having public picnics again, and it was amazing because what it did was it brought these laws into question, and the city held public forums, which was wonderful. And we were in these forums, and it was amazing to watch the church, especially, become the conscience of our city. And we had people from all different stripes. That there was this one woman, she was Pentecostal, and she stood up and she said, 15 years ago, God told me to start making casseroles and taking them out to homeless folks on the boulevard. So I started doing that, and I've been doing it for 15 years. Every week I go and I share homemade casseroles with folks on the street. And I have more than 4 people that come. And if the mayor wants to stop it, then the mayor better talk to God, because God's responsible. And right after her, we had a Catholic theologian that stood up and said, when we feed the homeless, we don't believe we're feeding some pitiful person on the streets. We believe it's a sacrament, that we are feeding Jesus. And he said, to say that we cannot feed the homeless is to say that we cannot feed Christ. And we are not going to come to God, and when God says, when I was hungry, did you feed me? We're not going to say, sorry, our mayor just wouldn't allow it. And he said, it is a violation of religious freedom to say that you cannot feed the homeless. It went all the way to a federal court that ruled it is indeed a violation of religious freedom to say you can't feed someone on the streets because it's a sacrament. Hallelujah, right? Like, I look at what happens when the church becomes the church and engages the world that we live in. We don't hide in sanctuaries and buildings, but we get into the streets and stuff happens, because that's what Dr. King said. You know, the church isn't meant to be the master or the servant of the state. We're meant to be the conscience of the state. We call people to love. We make sure that people know that folks on the margins are at the center of the kingdom of God. And now I'm so proud to say that in our city we also see a movement. I told you the bad story, so I got to feel like I can make Philly, be proud of my city as well. And one of the things that we've done well on is immigration. And the church has been in the forefront. We have a whole movement called the New Sanctuary Movement. Sanctuary churches, congregations, families that are welcoming refugees. And I got this is actually not from Philly, but it's a church. I love their sign. Of course we welcome refugees. We're Christians. Right? It's a no-brainer. Like, and what's so beautiful is, like, in Philly, this movement started happening, and all kinds of different congregations came together. And originally there was some pushback. I remember one congregation, they had begun welcoming folks into their building to sleep at night. And if there weren't, places for people to sleep, they said, hopefully we can get homes, for everyone to be in, or of your own eventually. But meanwhile, we can't have families on the street. And so they created these sanctuary churches, and some of the government officials, though, came in and they said, we don't know who these folks are. You got papers? Like, you aren't set up to run a shelter, and so we're going to shut it down. And it began to make news. And it was amazing, though, because this church, they were Pentecostal too. So they said, we're going to pray about this. And then they came back and they said, we've heard what you said, that we can't run a shelter. So we won't call it a shelter. But you should know we're going to be the church. And the church welcomes the stranger. Jesus said, when I was a stranger, you welcomed me. So we're going to welcome people. But we won't call it a shelter. We'll call it a revival. Because this is what church is, right? And so they said, we're going to have a revival every night. And they announced it publicly on the news. Every night at 8 o'clock, it's going to start, and it's going to go to the next morning. Lord willing. We went one night, right? And you had all these families that undoubtedly would be on the streets were it not for the warm hospitality of this church. And so everybody shared their stories. We had a meal together, and then, we had communion. We sang and worshiped. And then after like a couple hours, the pastor goes, all right, that concludes the formal worship service. The next 8 hours or so will be silent, contemplative prayer and meditation. Everybody have a good night. As far as I know, that revival's still going, and it's that which Jesus said, we're to be as shrewd as serpents and as innocent as doves, right? That we are to bear witness in this world. And now our city has this whole sanctuary movement that refuses to comply to the federal order of deportation. In fact, our own city council voted as a city, and our mayor backed it not to comply with the deportations. We are a sanctuary city. And I look at that, and I think that's what it looks like to be the church. When I was on I travel and preach a lot. I was in New Mexico, I was right on the border of the U.S. and Canada, and I was meeting with a group there that were in several different states, and they had begun to do these worship services. And they said, we started by doing hospitality. We have lawyers that are incredible lawyers to help people get proper documentation. They said, but then we decided, we need to actually bear witness. We need to make a public witness, a prophetic witness, because we don't wait on politicians in D.C. to tell us how to treat immigrants. We read the Bible, and it says, welcome the foreigner as if they were your own flesh and blood, that we're to welcome the stranger and know that we welcome Christ. And so they said the question is, how can we do that responsibly? But we needed to bear witness. And so they organized these worship services where they had folks on the Mexico side that met at the wall, and then they had folks on the U.S. side that met at the wall, and they sang each other worship songs over the wall. And then they said one week it got a little wild. The Spirit was moving. We decided we wanted to have communion together across the wall. So we took the bread and we threw it over there. And I look at that and I think, our love does not stop at borders, right? There's nothing that can contain the love of God. And for us to say, to be born again. And what Henri's work does so well is to say, if someone's suffering on the other side of that wall, it's as heartbreaking as if it were our own sister or brother, our own son or daughter. And now, one of the things that we've really been wrestling with in our city and in our country has been not just immigration, but gun violence. I know you don't know much about that up here, but we have an epidemic of it. And in fact, we have almost one homicide a day in Philadelphia. And 30,000 people a year that are dying, over 90 a day in our country. And so we look at that epidemic and we began public laments in Philadelphia, but around the country now, where one of the most powerful services we had was on Good Friday. And it's interesting because it was right after a young man was killed on our block. I heard the gunshots go out, and I ran outside, and literally right in front of our house, he fell to the ground. And he was still alive. I held his hand, and I prayed with him, and the ambulance came. And then the next morning, we found out that he didn't live. He was 19 years old. His name was Papito. And right after that, we went into the season of Lent, and it really did feel like the Spirit was moving around that time. And what we decided to do was join a larger movement in our city to have called Heeding God's Call, an incredible movement committed to ending gun violence. And we had our Good Friday vigil outside of the gun shop. And so the young men in our neighborhood, they took up the cross and they carried it in front of. This isn't just any gun shop, but it's one of the most infamous gun shops in our entire country for selling guns that are later tracked to violent crimes on the streets. And so we began to vigil outside of that, and it's one of the most powerful services I've ever been a part of, because we read the very familiar and powerful narrative, of the passion and suffering of Jesus, the death of Jesus on the cross that Good Friday, and the women weeping at the foot of the cross. But then we invited the mothers to come forward that had lost their kids. And they shared what that was like, with tears rolling down their faces. And there was something that happened, right? Where Calvary met Kensington, and the suffering of Jesus connected to the suffering of our streets. We even had a rabbi that came. She said, I don't come to a lot of Good Friday services, but I'm here for this one. And after that moving service, we also had some good preaching about how it's Friday and Sunday's coming. In the end, we know the tomb is empty. But we stayed in the pain on Good Friday. And this woman came up to me afterwards, and she's all teared up, and she says, I understand something I've never understood this way before. I said, what? And she said, God understands my pain. She started crying. And she said, God knows what it feels like to lose your son. And I realized it was Papito's mom. God understands what it feels like. God is very in tune with the pain of the world. But sometimes we move away from that pain, don't we? And so the challenge, I guess, for all of us constantly is to stay connected to that suffering. And there's always, new issues that raise up. I know living in our neighborhood, we had done a lot around the local violence, but then we're very hyper-local. Like everything we do is about this little walkable village we're trying to build, But then September 11th happened, and living in Philadelphia was interesting because we got New York on one side. We're sandwiched between New York and D.C., and so almost all of us knew people that were affected by that, and so we began to lament that, and then we began to see some really scary, ugly things that surfaced out of that, right? Where literally from City Hall in downtown Philadelphia, someone dropped a banner that said, "Let's kill them all and let God sort them out." So people were trying to find ways to deal with their anger and their grief and their fears, and there were ugly expressions of that. But then I also remembered hearing about family members in New York and D.C. that had gotten together to grieve and as a support group. And then they originally they had lost their husbands, wives, mothers, children, and they got together. But then as they began to see the war ensue, their whole prayer became, "Our grief is not a cry for war. Please don't kill in our name." That group has become known as September 11th, Families for Peaceful Tomorrows. And they're some of my heroes because of the way that they channeled their grief towards peace and reconciliation. And they went over on delegations to Iraq and Afghanistan. And everything about it looked like Jesus, And I can remember talking to one of the kids in my neighborhood, and I was telling him about them. And I said, "Well, what do you think we should do about September 11th? This is like September 12th, right?" And he said, "Well," he was like 10 years old. He goes, "Well, those people did something very evil and wrong." I said, "Yes, someone did." And Stephen said, "But I always say," he's 10 years old, right? "But I always say, 2 wrongs don't make a right." He said, "It doesn't make sense for us to try to hurt them back to show them how bad they hurt us." And I also began to hear the echo of Dr. King's words, as he said so beautifully that, I've told the kids in the ghettos that violence won't solve their problems. But then they ask me, and rightly so, why does our government use massive doses of violence to try to bring the change that it wants in the world? And Dr. King said, "I knew that I could no longer speak just against the violence of the ghettos without also speaking against the violence of our government." And so I joined, I got a call from Kathy Kelly and Voices for Creative Nonviolence, at the time Voices in the Wilderness, and saying that there was another delegation going. So I went to Iraq, as some of you know, one of many, many different delegations. And when I got to Iraq, I saw so many things that were different from what I anticipated. I think I had a certain image of who I would meet in Iraq. And first of all, the first time that I went to Iraq was March of 2003. And that was during the shock and awe campaign, the bombing of Baghdad. So our team was in Baghdad, and we saw some of the most horrific things that I can ever imagine. But what we also saw was the power of love and the resilience of mercy in the middle of that. We were invited everywhere by families, Iraqi families. We were going, and whenever there was a bombing, we would go there and be with the victims of that. We were volunteering in hospitals. But one of the amazing things was we were invited to worship services almost every night. And there was one worship service I went to where there were hundreds of folks packed out in this little church in Baghdad. And the bishops from all the different denominations stood at the altar, and they had written a statement that was addressed to Muslim people. And they said simply, they said this: "We want you to know that we love you, and that we are all made in the image of God, that we come from the same dust of this earth. We come from the same dysfunctional family of Abraham and Sarah. So we want you to know that we love you." And then they pointed to the cross and they said, "This cross doesn't make any sense to the wisdom of this world and the smarts of smart bombs, but the cross teaches us a way that we can interact with evil without becoming it, that we can love even those who would intend to hurt or kill us. We can say, 'Father, forgive them, for they don't know what they're doing.'" And then the congregation started busting out in Amazing Grace in Arabic. My Arabic wasn't great, so I kind of hummed along, but I was so moved. I had tears rolling down my face, and I beelined to the altar. It's kind of like an altar call. I went up afterwards, I grabbed the bishop, and I'm real excited at this point. And I'm like, "Bishop, this is powerful. I feel God in this place, And then I'm talking a little fast without thinking, and I said, "I had no idea that there's so many Christians in Baghdad." And he stopped me in my tracks, and he goes, "Yes, son, this is where Christianity started." And he pointed out the window and he goes, "That's the Tigris River and the Euphrates. Have you heard of them?" He said, "You didn't invent Christianity in North America. You guys just domesticated it. And you go back and you tell the church in North America that we are praying for them. We're praying for them to remember who they are. And this is a time to remember who we are." It was Dr. King, 50 years ago. He said, "These are extreme times that we're living in. And the question isn't whether or not we will be extremists, but what kind of extremists will we be? Will we be extremists for hatred or extremists for love?" I don't know about you, but I think the world's seen enough religious extremists for hatred, filled with hatred. No one kills with the passion in which they kill when they believe God is on their side. We've seen Christians do it. We've seen Jewish folks do it. You go in the Abrahamic Mosque and you can see the bullet holes in the walls as an extremist shot up Muslim folks in the middle of prayer. We've seen Christians blow up abortion clinics and shoot up Planned Parenthood, hold signs that say God hates fags, sick, distorted versions of Christianity. And yet I think the world is longing to see Christians who are filled with love, Christians who are compelled to engage this world. I'm excited about the afterlife, and we'll party like there's no tomorrow, and there won't be, but at the end of the day, we cannot settle for just promising people life after death when so many are asking if there's life before death, and if our gospel is not also good news for today. And so I want to close with some images, because I am very hopeful, and I'm hopeful in part because I see the trajectory of how powerfully God can transform hearts, and God can transform streets, and one of the images that caught us was the beautiful verse from the prophets Micah and Isaiah. "My people will beat their swords into plows and their spears into pruning hooks." And I heard Liz McAllister one time preach on this, and she said, what's beautiful about this image is peace doesn't begin with the nations or the kings and presidents or the commanders in chief. It begins with the people of God who refuse to kill and begin to transform weapons, disarm them, and turn them into tools that cultivate life. And then it follows that nation will not rise up against nation, and they will study violence no more. But it begins with the people. And so we thought, what are we waiting for? You know, we got some blacksmiths and welders, and they're Mennonites, of course, and we started practicing this because, you know, if you believe something's coming, then you can't help but begin to enact it, right? If you know this is a trajectory of where God's going, you know, is like turning swords into plows and transforming weapons into tools, and like part of expecting that is enacting that. And so we called for weapons, and we made a call, you know, on Facebook and Twitter. It's amazing what you can do with like social media. We're like, send us your guns, and people did. This guy had an AK-47, and he says, right, he literally says, yeah, I got an AK-47 in my closet. This is part of the problem, P.S., right, that we've got like 270 million guns, like 90 guns for every 100 people, almost one gun for every person in our country. So that's part of the problem. And he's like, yeah, I was looking at the AK-47, and I just thought, I'm not sure much good's going to come from this. So he donated it, and we took that AK-47, check this out, transformation from that to this, a shovel and a rake. So that was our first one, right? And it gets kind of contagious, you know, because you start doing this. And we got images from around the world of people that started doing transformations. This was a guitar made out of handguns that actually plays music. Steve, we got to get you one of these, brother man. And then we got a guy in Mozambique that had transformed a semi-automatic into a saxophone. And he was rocking out on it, right? And then check this out. I got this image from Iraq of the young people began to organize in Najaf, and they said, we want our young people to catch a vision of a world free of violence, the vision for a world of peace. And so they poured guns into the streets, and they ran over them with a steamroller. And they said, and we wanted the kids to lead the way, so they drove. Don't worry, their parents were with them, but they're driving as they crush those guns, right? And now we've made one after another. In fact, this last month, we heard that George Zimmerman, who killed Trayvon Martin, was auctioning off the gun that he used as he killed Trayvon. We're very sickened and disturbed by that, and so we originally thought we'll try to get that gun, but the bidding was over $100,000, you know, and so it brought up so many deep, deep troubling issues. And so we said, well, let's go a different direction. And we invited people to donate 9mm, the same gun that was used to kill Trayvon. In 24 hours, we had like 6 of them donated. We've transformed them, and we're giving one to Trayvon's family, but we're also auctioning one off right now. And all of that money will go to Trayvon's family. But one of the most, you can bid on it on our website. But I want to close with this story, because one of the most powerful transformations that we did was we got a handgun from Philadelphia. It was in an abandoned house. And we took that gun and we heated it up in the forge. But this time, instead of our Mennonite blacksmiths, we decided to invite the mothers that had lost their kids to actually do the transformation. And this mother and others like her, as they took the hammer, she's actually got a picture of her son who was killed in a senseless act of violence in Philadelphia. She took that hammer, and as she started hammering on the gun, with every thump of the hammer, she said, "This is for my boy." And there was something mystical that happened, as it felt like she was participating in the work of God to transform hearts and streets and a world full of violence. And this is what we made that day. In fact, it's not really easy, but I actually managed to bring it. And I have it, and I want to pass it around as we close. And as you hold it, I want you to remember the pain, right, of the world that we live in right now, but also the hope that this world is transforming. And it begins, as Henri Nouwen shows us so well, it begins in our own hearts as we are disarmed, as we are changed into new people. But then it necessarily takes us into the broken streets and into a violence-riddled world to transform this world through the power of God's Spirit. So I'll pass that around. And as we pass that around, when we were in Iraq, my friend heard these kids singing, and they were singing a familiar song, but they were singing it in Arabic. And he heard them, and he was like, oh my gosh, we got to get this on tape. So he grabbed a little handheld recorder. And there's no better way I can imagine for us to close this session than with the voices of the kids in Iraq who remind us that the world is not that big, and that their suffering is our suffering, and their hope that they shall overcome is also our hope. So these are kids in Iraq singing We Shall Overcome.
نحن نمشي يدا بيد نحن نمشي يدا بيد نحن نمشي يدا بيد اليوم في أعماق قلبي أنا أؤمن نحن نمشي يدا بيد اليوم نحن لسنا خائفين نحن لسنا خائفين نحن لسنا خائفين اليوم في أعماق قلبي أنا أؤمن نحن لسنا خائفين اليوم We shall overcome. We shall overcome. We shall overcome someday.
Oh, deep in my heart, I do believe we shall overcome someday. Amen.